Do not stop walking, or you will freeze where you stand. The command was screamed into the gale, a desperate plea directed at no one but the empty, swirling white void. The woman known as Evelyn stumbled, her boots failing to find purchase on the treacherous, ice-slicked slope of the mountain pass. The cold was not merely a temperature, it was a physical weight, a cruel hand pressing down upon her chest until every breath became a labor of agony. She had traveled far to escape the suffocating reach of her former life. But it seemed the mountain was determined to claim her, long before she could find the sanctuary she sought. Her past was a shadow that refused to let her be, a secret that had driven her into this frozen hell. But the truth was far more complicated than anyone imagined. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button, and comment what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The howling wind tore at the wool of the heavy coat she wore, a garment that had belonged to a traveler who no longer needed it. Evelyn felt the numbness creeping from her toes up to her knees. A silent, creeping death. She reached out, her fingers catching on nothing but the biting air. And then the world tilted. She collapsed, her knees hitting the frozen ground with a dull thud that she barely felt. The snow was soft, almost inviting, a white blanket promising a long, eternal sleep. She closed her eyes, the exhaustion dragging her down. It was so easy to simply drift away, to let the bitterness of her memories fade into the absolute zero of the storm. Somewhere, in the distance, a sound pierced the cacophony of the wind. It was not the howl of a wolf or the crack of breaking timber. It was a rhythmic thud, heavy and intentional. A silhouette emerged from the swirling white, a figure so large he seemed to be a part of the mountain itself. Silas moved with a gait that suggested he was entirely unbothered by the fury of the gale. He was a man built of granite and patience. His eyes narrowed against the biting sleet. When he spotted the heap of dark cloth buried in the snowdrift, he did not hesitate. He moved with a speed that belied his massive frame, kneeling in the snow beside the shivering, broken form. He reached out, his hands enormous and calloused, and brushed the snow away from the face of the woman. She was pale, her skin like fine porcelain that had been shattered and glued back together. Silas grunted, a low, rumbling sound that vibrated in his chest. He scooped her up as if she weighed no more than a bundle of dry kindling. She was freezing, her skin iced to the touch, and the silence of her presence was more alarming to him than the roar of the blizzard. He wrapped his own heavy coat around her, shielding her from the bite of the wind, and turned back toward the sanctuary of his home. The journey was a blur of movement and shadow. Silas navigated the familiar paths of the mountain with an instinct that required no sight. He knew every rock, every twist of the trail, and every danger that lurked in the dark. He carried her into the warmth of the cabin, the door groaning as he kicked it shut against the howling world outside. The air within was thick with the scent of cedar and dried herbs, a stark contrast to the deathly chill of the storm. He placed her gently upon the heavy rug before the hearth, where the fire crackled with a life of its own. Silas knelt and began the process of warming her, his movements methodical and calm. He stoked the fire, coaxing the flames to climb higher, and then set a kettle to boil over the iron grate. He worked in total silence, a practice he had maintained for years. The mountain did not ask for chatter, and neither did he. He watched her, noting the way her hands curled into small, tight fists, even in her unconscious state. There was a tension in her frame that suggested she was waiting for a blow, a readiness to endure pain that was deeply ingrained in the way she held herself. He found it disturbing. Most people who sought refuge in these mountains brought with them stories of bad luck or misfortune. But this woman carried a trauma that felt older, more jagged. As the warmth of the cabin began to seep into her limbs, Evelyn stirred. Her eyelashes fluttered, and she gasped, her eyes flying open. They were amber, wide with a terror that looked for an enemy in every corner of the room. She scrambled backward, trying to distance herself from him, her breath coming in shallow, jagged rasps. She looked at Silas, and for a moment, the fear was so intense it seemed to vibrate in the air between them. He did not move closer. He simply sat back on his heels, his expression unreadable, his massive hands resting quietly on his knees. He represented the antithesis of the threat she had fled, a force of stillness in a world of violence. Yet she stared at him as if he were a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. "You are safe," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that sounded like stones grinding together beneath a river. It was the first time he had spoken in weeks. Evelyn did not answer. She merely continued to shrink away, her back pressing against the rough timber of the wall. She looked at the door, then back to the fire, then finally to him, her eyes searching for the motive behind his kindness. There was no trust in her gaze, only a desperate, frantic attempt to assess her surroundings for danger. She pulled the edges of the oversized coat tighter around her throat, as if to hide not just her shivering form, but something far more fragile beneath the layers of fabric. Silas stood, his frame casting a long, imposing shadow across the floor, yet he carefully averted his gaze, giving her the space she clearly craved. He picked up a wooden bowl and filled it with warm broth, setting it on the floor, a safe distance from where she huddled. He walked away to the far side of the room, turning his back to her to give her the illusion of privacy. "Eat," he commanded softly. Evelyn watched the bowl, her stomach betraying her, with a sharp, hungry ache. She looked at the man, the mountain giant, who had plucked her from the grip of death, and wondered what sort of price he would demand for such charity. She had learned the hard way that no one offered help without a desire for repayment, often in currency she was unable to pay. But the hunger was undeniable. Slowly, tentatively, she reached out, her fingers trembling as she grasped the bowl. As the sleeve of the coat slid back, a flash of something dark and angry revealed itself upon her wrist, a mark that did not belong there. Silas caught the movement, his eyes narrowing as he stared into the heart of the fire. He had seen the mark. He knew the look of bruises that came from someone else's hand. The air in the cabin grew heavy, charged with a sudden, sharp intensity that had nothing to do with the warmth of the hearth. Why had she come to these mountains? And what kind of man had forced her into the path of a blizzard just to escape him? The heat radiating from the hearth of the cabin was a living thing, pushing back the oppressive chill that still clung to the bones of the woman. Evelyn held the wooden bowl with both hands, letting the warmth bleed into her pale skin. The broth tasted of roasted bones and wild herbs, a rich and heavy flavor that anchored her tightly to the present moment. She swallowed slowly, savoring the heat as it traveled down her throat, easing the violent tremors that had racked her slender frame. The storm outside continued to batter the thick timber walls, roaring like a wounded beast. But inside, the heavy logs offered an impenetrable barrier against the fury of nature. Across the room, the mountain man remained a silent sentinel. Silas sat upon a low wooden stool, far out of the direct line of the firelight. The shadows wrapped around his massive shoulders, softening the hard, weathered lines of his face. He kept his hands visible, resting them openly upon his knees, a deliberate posture meant to convey total harmlessness. The stillness of the man was entirely unnatural to Evelyn. In her painful experience, men of such size and strength used their physical presence to dominate, to consume the space within a room until there was absolutely no air left for anyone else to breathe. Yet this giant seemed intent on making himself as unobtrusive as possible, pulling his massive frame inward to allow her the illusion of control. She finished the broth and set the empty bowl upon the floorboards. The sound of wood scraping against wood echoed like a gunshot in the quiet confines of the cabin. Evelyn gasped, pulling her knees tightly to her chest, her amber eyes darting rapidly toward the corner where the man sat in shadow. She expected anger. She expected a harsh reprimand for the sudden noise. Silas merely blinked. He slowly uncrossed his legs and stood to his full height. The sheer size of him forced Evelyn to press her back much harder against the rough timber of the wall. She drew the collar of the borrowed coat higher up her neck, a subtle recurring gesture of defense, attempting to shield herself from the inevitable violence she firmly believed was coming. She tucked her chin down, minimizing herself, preparing for the heavy weight of a hand to fall upon her. Instead of walking toward her, Silas moved slowly to a large wooden chest near the heavy door. He opened the heavy lid without making a sound and retrieved 2 thick woolen blankets. He walked toward the center of the room, stopping precisely halfway between his own position and her huddled form. He placed the blankets carefully upon a small wooden stool and took 3 large, deliberate steps backward, returning immediately to the shadows. "Rest," he commanded softly, the rumble in his chest barely louder than the crackle of the burning logs. Evelyn stared at the folded fabric resting upon the stool. The offer of warmth, given without a single demand for proximity, was an act of profound kindness that she simply did not know how to process. She waited, watching the chest of the man rise and fall in a slow, exceptionally even rhythm. When he did not take another step forward, she crept out from her corner, her movements mimicking those of a frightened, cornered doe. She snatched the blankets with trembling fingers and retreated instantly back to her corner, wrapping the heavy wool around her shaking shoulders. The scent of pine and clean snow lingered deep within the fabric. It was a comforting aroma, a small beat of warmth that gently eased the tight knot of panic in her chest. The long night stretched on, measured only by the ticking of frozen snow against the window pane and the steady hiss of the fire. Silas did not sleep. He sat by the frost-covered window, a block of smooth wood in one hand and a small carving knife in the other. He did not cut into the wood. He merely ran the wide pad of his thumb over the smooth surface of the handle, a quiet habit of a man deeply accustomed to long, unbroken hours of solitude. His mind turned over the brief image he had seen earlier in the evening. The dark, ugly bruise upon the pale wrist of the woman. It was a terrible brand of cruelty, a violent story written in purple and yellow upon delicate, fragile skin. He recognized the terrified posture of a creature that had been hunted relentlessly. He recognized the way she breathed, keeping her breaths shallow and exceedingly quiet so as not to draw attention. He recognized the way she tracked his every movement without turning her head, using only her peripheral vision to monitor the threat. He knew with absolute certainty that any sudden action would shatter the incredibly fragile truce they had formed. The trust of a wounded animal must be earned through endless patience and respectful distance. He would gladly give her the entirety of the room if he could. He wanted her to feel the safety of the heavy walls, to know that the storm outside was the only monster allowed near this sanctuary, as the very first hint of pale gray dawn began to filter weakly through the frost-covered glass. The fire in the hearth began to die down to glowing red embers. The bitter cold pressed eagerly against the walls of the cabin, seeking an entry point. Silas set aside his small knife and his block of wood. He stood, his massive frame completely blocking the weak light of the early morning. Evelyn jerked awake from a shallow, deeply restless slumber. Her amber eyes immediately found his silhouette. She pushed herself upright against the wall, the heavy blankets pooling around her waist. Silas turned toward the hearth, his focus entirely upon the dying heat. He reached out his right arm to grasp a heavy iron poker resting against the hearthstones. The movement was entirely utilitarian, a simple and necessary action to stir the dying embers and bring the fire back to life. The exact moment his arm raised upward, Evelyn let out a sharp, choked sound of pure terror. She threw both of her arms violently over her head, curling her body into a tight, defensive ball. Her entire frame braced for a heavy impact that did not come. The sheer, blinding terror in her visceral reaction was absolute and utterly devastating to witness. Silas froze mid-motion. The heavy iron poker hovered mere inches from the stones. He looked at the trembling, hidden form of the woman, his heart suddenly heavy with a dark sorrow he could not properly name. He lowered his arm very, very slowly. He placed both of his large hands firmly at his sides, stepping back from the hearth entirely. He did not speak a single word. He did not try to step forward to comfort her, knowing intimately that his mere proximity was the direct source of her absolute terror. He simply waited, still as a mountain pine, until the frantic heaving of her chest began to slow, giving her the silent, undeniable assurance that he would absolutely not strike her. The silence slowly returned to the room, but it was no longer a peaceful quiet. It was heavy with the suffocating weight of unspeakable secrets and hidden violence. Silas watched the small flame struggle bravely against the cold air, a deep and fiercely protective anger kindling hot within his own broad chest. He remained perfectly still, wondering intensely about the nature of the monster, who had taught this delicate, beautiful woman to expect pain instead of warmth. Why does she flinch every time he raises his hand to fix the fire? The brutal howling of the wind finally ceased, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt incredibly heavy upon the ears. The morning sun pierced the thick frost on the window panes, casting long, pale beams of light across the wooden floorboards. The storm had broken, but the fragile peace within the cabin remained dangerously thin. Silas understood the desperate need for solitude after a night of pure terror. He moved toward the heavy front door, making his footsteps intentionally loud. He lifted a large wooden bucket, ensuring the metal handle clattered sharply against the rim to announce his exact intentions. He paused by the sturdy wooden table. He placed a small tin basin upon the flat surface, pouring hot water from the iron kettle until the steam rose in a thick, comforting cloud. Beside the basin, he laid a folded square of clean, soft cotton and a sliver of mild soap smelling faintly of crushed pine needles. It was a simple, quiet offering of dignity. He did not look toward the corner where the woman huddled beneath the heavy wool. He simply opened the heavy door and stepped out into the blinding white snow, pulling the iron latch completely shut behind him. Evelyn remained perfectly still for several long minutes. She listened to the crunch of heavy boots fading into the distance. The cabin was finally empty. She slowly pushed the heavy woolen blankets away from her trembling legs. The air was cool, but the radiant heat from the hearth kept the worst of the winter chill at bay. She stood, her limbs stiff and aching from the exhausting ordeal of the previous day. She approached the table with hesitant, measured steps, eyeing the steaming basin as if it were a mirage that might vanish if she reached out to touch it. The aroma of the pine soap was incredibly grounding, a scent that belonged to ancient forests and deep roots, far removed from the suffocating perfumes of the drawing rooms she had left behind. She reached out, dipping her pale fingers into the heated water. The warmth traveled rapidly up her arms, a small but profound comfort in a world that had offered her nothing but cold cruelty. She closed her eyes, allowing the steam to rise against her face, pretending for one brief moment that she was entirely safe. With trembling hands, she unfastened the top buttons of the massive, hand-borrowed coat. She let the heavy fabric slip from her slender shoulders, allowing it to pool softly around her waist. Beneath the coarse wool, the truth of her past life was starkly visible. She wore a high-collared bodice of fine, delicate silk, intricately stitched with expensive lace. However, the exquisite garment was torn at the seams, stained with dark mud, and hopelessly ruined. It was the clothing of a woman of high station, yet it hung upon her thin, exhausted frame like the rags of a beggar. The contrast was jarring, a silent testament to a sudden, violent fall from grace. She dipped the cloth into the water and began to scrub the dried dirt from her pale face. The heavy latch of the door suddenly rattled. The metallic sound echoed through the quiet room like a sudden clap of thunder. Evelyn gasped. Her immediate visceral reaction took over. She snatched the collar of her torn bodice, her fingers twisting desperately into the delicate fabric, attempting to pull it higher around her neck. This defensive posture was a deeply ingrained habit, a frantic attempt to conceal the vulnerable skin of her throat. The heavy timber door swung open, bringing a sharp gust of frigid mountain air and the massive, towering frame of the mountain man into the room. Silas stepped over the threshold, his eyes immediately dropping to the floorboards to offer her the respect of complete privacy. But the sudden draft from the open door caught the loose, torn edge of the silk bodice. As Evelyn scrambled backward in absolute panic, the delicate fabric slipped completely down her left shoulder, drooping dangerously low. For a single, fleeting second, the gaze of the giant lifted. The pale morning light illuminated the exposed skin of her shoulder and collarbone. The breath entirely vanished from the massive chest of the man. Shadows lived under the silk. A violent, horrific tapestry of deep purple, angry black, and, sickly, fading yellow mottled the delicate skin of her collarbone, trailing downward in cruel streaks toward her heart. The bruises were large, overlapping, and sickeningly brutal. They were the undeniable marks of repeated, heavy blows. The small bruise upon her wrist from the night before was utterly insignificant compared to the extensive devastation hidden beneath her expensive clothing. The eyes of the mountain man hardened into chips of pure blue ice. The silence in the room transformed instantly from a peaceful quiet into a charged, electric tension. He averted his gaze immediately, turning his broad back to her with a swift, decisive motion. He felt a fierce, terrifying guardian instinct ignite deep within the core of his being. He had spent his entire life in the untamed wilderness. He knew the vicious nature of predators, the primal drive for survival that governed the beasts of the forest. He had witnessed the aftermath of wolf packs and the impartial cruelty of harsh winters. But the supreme violence he had just glimpsed was far worse than the natural order of the wild. It was a calculated, deliberate evil inflicted by the hand of another human being, meant not to kill, but to break the spirit. The woman standing trembling in his home was not simply a lost traveler caught in a storm. She was a survivor fleeing a monster who wore the mask of a civilized man. Silas walked deliberately toward a wooden peg on the far wall. He reached up and pulled down a large, incredibly soft shirt made of thick red flannel. He did not turn around. He simply tossed the garment backward, over his massive shoulder. The soft fabric sailed through the air and landed with a gentle thud upon the edge of the table. "Wool scratches," he murmured, his deep voice carefully leveled to hide the fierce anger burning within him. "Flannel is better." Evelyn stared at the red shirt resting upon the table. It was clean, completely worn soft by years of rugged use, and carried the deeply reassuring scent of cedarwood and safe, quiet evenings. It was a tangible shield, freely given without expectation. She reached out with shaking fingers and pulled the heavy flannel against her chest, letting the oversized warmth envelop her fragile frame entirely. She watched the broad back of the man as he knelt upon the stone hearth, busying himself with the fire to grant her the absolute illusion of solitude. He knew. He had seen the marks of her profound shame, the hideous map of her suffering. Yet, he offered absolutely no judgment, no prying questions, and no cruel pity. He offered only a soft garment to hide her pain and the warmth of his hearth to soothe her bones. The bruised wrist and the ruined shoulder were only the visible edges of a much darker, hidden canvas. What exactly is the extent of the harm she has endured? The days following the great storm settled into a rhythm of thick, unbroken snow and profound quiet. The world outside the heavy timber door was a frozen, hostile wasteland. Yet, inside the cabin, a delicate ecosystem of survival began to take root. Evelyn remained in the corner nearest the stone hearth. The massive red flannel shirt swallowed her slender frame entirely, the hem pooling around her knees while the long sleeves hid her pale hands. The thick fabric was a fortress, a tangible barrier between her bruised skin and the imposing presence of the mountain man. Silas did not force conversation. He understood that words were often the tools of deceivers, empty vessels used to manipulate and control. Instead, he spoke the only language he entirely trusted. He spoke the language of labor. He stood before a long, scarred wooden workbench positioned beneath the frost-framed window. A thick length of pale ash wood rested upon the table. The massive hands of the man gripped a sharp, steel drawknife. He pulled the blade across the surface of the wood with a steady, practiced motion. Sheik. Shk. Shk. The sound was rhythmic, exceptionally steady, and deeply predictable. Long, curling ribbons of pale wood fell to the floorboards, filling the warm air of the cabin with the bright, clean scent of fresh timber. For a woman who had spent the last 2 years learning to read the unpredictable, heavy footsteps of a volatile tyrant, this steady predictability was an absolute revelation. In the dark halls of her past life, the sudden silence of a room was a terrifying prelude to violence. A quiet house meant the monster was hunting. Here, within the walls of the mountain cabin, the silence was simply silence. The rhythmic scraping of the blade was a steady metronome, a deeply soothing sound that loudly broadcasted the exact location and intention of the massive man. He was not creeping in the shadows. He was simply working. Evelyn watched him from beneath the protective veil of her auburn hair. She kept her chin tucked securely against the thick flannel collar, a subtle recurring habit born from a desperate need to protect her vulnerable throat. The sheer physical size of the man remained a daunting reality. His shoulders were broad enough to block the light of the window entirely. Yet, the way those enormous, calloused hands handled the delicate curves of the ashwood presented a jarring paradox To her frightened mind, the hands of the cruel man in her past were soft, meticulously manicured, and entirely unblemished by hard labor. Yet, those same soft hands hit with the devastating force of an iron hammer. The hands of Silas were rough, scarred by a lifetime of wrestling with the unforgiving wilderness. Yet, they smoothed the pale wood with a profound, breathtaking gentleness. She watched as his thick thumb traced the grain of the timber, searching for any hidden flaw or sharp splinter. It was a beautiful Pytarps, mesmerizing contrast. He possessed the raw strength to snap the wood entirely in half, but he chose to use that immense power to shape it, to refine it, to build something new. The afternoon sunlight slowly shifted across the floorboards. Silas paused his labor. He set the draw knife down with a gentle motion, ensuring the metal did not clang harshly against the table. He walked slowly toward the hearth, keeping his eyes firmly focused on the stones. He picked up 2 thick logs and placed them carefully onto the fire, adjusting the damper to ensure the radiant heat would continuously reach the exact corner where the woman sat. It was a small, quiet beat of warmth, a silent promise that he was actively tending to her comfort. He returned to his workbench. He picked up a small, rectangular scrap of the pale ash wood. He reached for a piece of rough sandstone, rubbing the stone over the wood until the edges were perfectly rounded and smooth. He turned, walked precisely halfway across the room, and placed the small wooden block upon the floor. He took 3 large steps backward, returning to his station. Evelyn stared at the offering. The rhythm of his predictable movements gave her a small measure of courage. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, her movements mimicking those of a cautious woodland creature. She retrieved the smooth wooden block and retreated instantly back to her corner. She pulled the oversized sleeves of the red flannel over her knuckles, bringing the smooth, sanded wood to her cheek. The texture was perfect, entirely devoid of any sharp edge. It was a small, physical totem of safety. The lingering scent of cedarwood upon the borrowed shirt mixed perfectly with the fresh aroma of the ash wood, wrapping her in a cocoon of sensory comfort. As the sun finally dipped below the jagged peaks of the mountains, the true purpose of his long labor became entirely clear. Silas assembled the carved pieces with meticulous care. He was not simply shaping wood for the fire. He was building a chair. The only seating in the cabin consisted of his own large, heavy stool and a massive armchair that would easily swallow her petite frame. He had specifically carved the legs of this new chair much shorter, and he had curved the backrest to cradle a delicate spine. He was building a piece of furniture tailored exclusively for her small stature. He tapped the final wooden peg into place, securing the joints with quiet strength. He lifted the finished chair and carried it toward the hearth. He set it down gently upon the thick rug, placing it a respectful distance from his own stool, yet perfectly angled to catch the heat of the fire. He looked at the small chair, and then he looked at the floorboards near her huddled form. A place to sit, he rumbled softly, his deep voice carrying no expectation or demand. The floor is cold. He immediately walked away, stepping out into the frigid evening air to gather more firewood, granting her the absolute privacy to accept the gift unwatched. Evelyn stared at the chair. The pale ash wood gleamed warmly in the firelight. She pushed herself up from the floor, her legs trembling slightly. She approached the chair and slowly lowered herself onto the solid wooden seat. The proportions were absolutely perfect. Her small, booted feet rested entirely flat upon the floorboards. The curved backrest supported her weary spine with steadfast strength. It was not merely a piece of furniture. It was a throne of safety, built exclusively for her from the wreckage of a brutal storm. She sat in the quiet, empty cabin, surrounded by the smell of fresh wood shavings and lingering pine soap. For the very first time in years, she felt a strange, deeply foreign fluttering deep within her chest. It was a tiny, fragile ember of emotional safety. He was a creature of immense, terrifying power. Yet, he consciously chose to build a resting place for a broken stranger. But the deep, ugly shadows hidden beneath the torn silk of her bodice continued to haunt her waking thoughts. The profound cruelty of her past was heavily rooted in her bones. The horrific memories whispered dark warnings against, hoping for lasting peace. The betrayal of her past had completely shattered her understanding of safety. Can Evelyn ever trust a man again after what she has seen? The flour barrel in the corner of the cabin rang hollow. It was a dull, echoing sound that signaled absolute necessity. The deep winter required provisions, and the small frontier settlement located 3 miles down the steep mountain pass was the only reliable source. Silas hitched his massive draft horse to the heavy wooden sled. He stood in the open doorway, the biting wind whipping the rugged edges of his heavy canvas coat. He looked toward the corner of the room, focusing on the woman, sitting quietly in her perfectly carved chair. "I must go to the valley," he murmured, his deep voice filling the quiet space. "You may stay by the fire." The heavy iron bolt locks from the inside. Evelyn looked at the thick metal latch upon the timber door. The thought of remaining alone in the remote wilderness was completely paralyzing. The dark shadows of her past were incredibly loud when the cabin was entirely empty. The monster from her memories often visited her fragile mind when she was left completely to her own thoughts. She stood slowly. She pulled the collar of the oversized red flannel tight against her throat, her chin tucking downward instinctively in that subtle, recurring gesture of deep defense. "I will go with you," she breathed, the frightened words trembling upon the frosty air. Silas gave a single, slow nod. He retrieved a thick, fur-lined cloak from the large wooden chest near the window. He walked toward the open door, stopping exactly halfway across the room. He extended his large arm, holding the heavy garment out to her, ensuring he maintained a highly respectful distance. It was a quiet beat of warmth, a clear demonstration that he would absolutely never force physical contact. She accepted the heavy fur, wrapping it securely over the flannel shirt to hide her broken form. The journey down the mountain was a stark contrast to the terrifying blizzard of her arrival. The sky above was a piercing, crystalline blue. The massive hooves of the draft horse crunched steadily over the packed snow, creating a mesmerizing, rhythmic sound. Evelyn sat upon the wooden bench of the sled, entirely buried beneath a thick pile of heavy wolf pelts. Silas drove the horse while standing directly behind her, his towering form acting as a perfect, solid windbreak against the freezing draft of the valley. The frontier settlement was a chaotic collection of rough-hewn buildings, muddy streets, and loud, bustling crowds. The sharp, overwhelming scent of burning coal and stale whiskey hung heavily in the freezing air. For Evelyn, the sudden noise was utterly terrifying. The sheer number of unfamiliar people moving around the wooden boardwalks sent a sharp spike of absolute panic straight through her chest. She shrank deeper into the fur cloak, attempting desperately to become entirely invisible. Silas guided her carefully toward the general store, his massive strides slowing down specifically to match her hesitant, tiny steps. He positioned his broad shoulders deliberately between her fragile form and the crowded street. It was a silent, moving fortress, shielding her from the prying eyes of the rough frontier town. The interior of the general store was intensely warm, smelling heavily of roasted coffee beans, cured leather, and sweet pipe tobacco. Evelyn remained close to the front window, keeping her back pressed firmly against the frosted glass. She watched the giant man negotiate with the shopkeeper. He purchased heavy sacks of flour, dried beans, and salt. Then, he paused. He looked toward a small display of delicate goods upon the front wooden counter. He reached out and picked up a beautiful, smooth wooden comb and a dark green woolen shawl. He added them to the pile of provisions. He paid for the goods without uttering a single word. It was a profound beat of warmth. He remembered the tangled state of her auburn hair and the ruined, torn silk of her bodice, and he sought to restore her dignity without drawing any attention to her shame. Well, now, what exactly do we have over here? The voice was loud, incredibly coarse, and entirely too close. A large man wearing a filthy coat stepped right into the immediate personal space of Evelyn. He smelled terribly of cheap spirits and unwashed sweat. His eyes roamed aggressively over her hidden form, his mouth curling into a dark, predatory sneer. The mountain man finally brought a woman down from the high rocks. The aggressive stranger taunted loudly, drawing the eager attention of the entire store. A little widow, the folks say. She looks mighty frail. Do you need someone to keep you warm? Little bird? The stranger reached out a dirty, callous hand, intending to grab the edge of her fur cloak. Evelyn froze completely. The breath vanished entirely from her lungs. The terrible memories rushed back with violent, crushing force. The familiar feeling of being trapped, the suffocating presence of a cruel man asserting dominance. She squeezed her amber eyes shut tightly, bracing her delicate frame for the inevitable, brutal contact. The contact never arrived. A massive shadow fell across the wooden floorboards, blocking the yellow lamplight entirely. Silas moved with a terrifying, absolute silence. He did not shout. He did not raise his heavy arms. He simply stepped perfectly between Evelyn and the aggressive townsman. The sheer, overwhelming mass of the mountain giant forced the coarse man to stumble backward several paces. The warm air in the store turned instantly to ice. Move away, Silas commanded. His voice was not loud. It was a low, vibrating rumble of pure, barely restrained violence. The tone carried the undeniable, terrifying promise of immediate destruction. The aggressive man looked slowly up at the flint-hard eyes of the giant. The predatory sneer vanished completely, replaced instantly by stark, naked fear. He swallowed hard, raised his dirty hands in a frantic, placating gesture, and scrambled hurriedly out the front door, the brass bell jingling wildly in his sudden wake. The silence inside the store was absolute. The other patrons stared in wide-eyed shock. Silas did not acknowledge them. He turned his broad back to the staring crowd. He looked down at Evelyn. Her amber eyes were wide, filled with a swirling mixture of raw terror and sudden, profound awe. He reached out and gently draped the newly purchased green woolen shawl over her trembling shoulders. It was the final warmth beat of the day, a physical comfort offered immediately after a moment of intense fear. The sled is ready, he murmured softly, the terrifying danger in his voice evaporating completely as he spoke exclusively to her. They walked back out into the freezing air. The winter sun began to sink rapidly behind the jagged peaks of the valley. Evelyn sat upon the wooden bench of the sled, clutching the smooth wooden comb and the warm green wool tightly against her chest. She looked up at the massive man standing silently beside the draft horse. He had protected her fiercely. He had not demanded any gratitude. He had not used the frightening incident to assert his own dominance over her. He had simply acted as an impenetrable shield against the cruelty of the world. The sled began to climb the steep, icy trail back toward the quiet safety of the high rocks. Evelyn felt a profound emotional reflection taking deep root within her bruised heart. She was a woman intimately accustomed to being utterly destroyed by the power of men. Yet, the immense, terrifying power of this silent giant was entirely dedicated to preserving her fragile dignity. She was beginning to rely upon him, not merely for food and basic shelter, but for the profound emotional safety his mere presence provided. However, as the sled moved further away from the settlement, the echoing whispers of the onlookers remained incredibly sharp in her mind. She knew the cruel nature of small towns. The people would talk, they would weave dark, vicious tales about the broken woman and the giant who claimed her. The judgment of the world was a heavy, suffocating blanket that threatened to smother the tiny spark of peace she had found. Will the townspeople talk about her? And will Silas defend her reputation? The heavy iron bolt slid home with a solid, definitive thud, sealing the mountain cabin against the freezing night. The harrowing journey to the valley settlement was over, and the harsh, judging eyes of the world were locked firmly outside the thick timber walls. Within, the small, warm room, the scent of burning cedar and the newly purchased dried provisions created a rich, comforting atmosphere. Evelyn stood near the glowing hearth, the dark green woolen shawl draped heavily over her small, trembling shoulders. She felt the lingering adrenaline of the town slowly fading, replaced by a profound, deep exhaustion. Yet, beneath the weariness, a new, fragile sensation was attempting to take root. It was the undeniable feeling of returning home. Silas did not rest. He moved directly to the long wooden table, unpacking the burlap sacks of flour, dried beans, and salt. His massive hands handled the rough canvas with practiced ease. He retrieved a heavy iron knife and began to slice a portion of cured meat, intending to prepare a simple evening meal. He was a man deeply accustomed to absolute self-reliance, expecting nothing from the quiet woman huddled near the fire. He moved with that same predictable, steady rhythm, ensuring his sheer size did not startle her. Evelyn watched him from the safety of her perfectly carved ash wood chair. She pulled the edges of the green shawl tightly across her chest, her chin tucking downward into the thick wool in her subtle, recurring gesture of defense. For her entire adult life, the act of serving a man was firmly rooted in raw terror. She had cooked, cleaned, wad, and organized out of a desperate, frantic need to appease a volatile tyrant, knowing intimately that a misplaced fork or a cold bowl of soup would immediately invite a brutal, heavy blow. Service was a degrading tool of survival. It was never a choice. However, as she watched the silent mountain giant meticulously preparing their meager supper, a quiet shift occurred within her bruised heart. She was no longer a captive. She was a guest in a sanctuary built of stone and wood, protected by a guardian who asked for absolutely nothing in return. The urge to contribute, to offer some small token of gratitude for the immense safety he provided, swelled within her chest. It was a terrifying prospect to approach a man while he held a sharp blade, but the need to reclaim her own dignity pushed her forward. She stood slowly. She walked toward the long wooden table with silent, measured steps. Silas paused his work, his broad shoulders tensing slightly as he sensed her approach. He did not turn around immediately, granting her the complete control of the distance between them. Evelyn reached out with a trembling hand and picked up a large wooden spoon resting near the iron kettle. It was a profound beat of warmth, a silent offering of assistance. Silas slowly turned his head. He looked at the fragile woman standing beside him, the heavy green shawl making her appear even smaller against his towering frame. He looked at the wooden spoon in her pale hand. He did not command her to return to her corner. He did not snatch the spoon away. Instead, brass. He took one large, deliberate step backward, relinquishing his place at the table entirely. It was a powerful, unspoken agreement. He granted her the space and the autonomy to act. Evelyn moved closer to the table. She gathered the sliced meat and the root vegetables he had prepared, sweeping them carefully into the iron kettle. She stirred the simmering broth, the rich, hearty aroma filling the small cabin. The simple act of preparing food without the suffocating weight of fear was an absolute revelation. She found a deep emotional reflection in the gentle bubbling of the water. She was healing. The dark, terrifying shadows of her past were still present, but they were no longer dictating her every movement. She was actively participating in her own survival, finding a profound sense of purpose and belonging in the quiet rhythm of the domestic task. When the meal was ready, she filled 2 tin bowls. She placed one bowl at the head of the table. She hesitated for a fleeting moment, then placed the second bowl directly opposite his chair. Rather than retreating to her solitary corner near the hearth, Silas walked to the table. He sat down heavily upon his large wooden stool. He looked at the steaming bowl placed before him, then raised his flint blue eyes to look at Evelyn. He reached out with his own iron spoon, scooping a large, tender portion of the cured meat from his bowl and transferring it gently into hers. It was the second warmth beat of the evening, a silent insistence that she must rebuild her shattered strength. They ate the meal in complete, companionable silence. The absence of words was no longer a heavy, oppressive void. It was a shared peace, a comfortable space where neither of them was required to perform or explain. Evelyn tasted the savory broth, the warmth spreading deeply into her chest. She belonged here, in this quiet moment, entirely safe from the violent storms of the outside world. After the meal, she carried the tin bowls to the wash basin. She cleaned them meticulously, the scent of the pine soap mingling with the remnants of the hearty stew. Silas returned to his workbench, picking up his block of wood and his carving knife. He resumed his steady, rhythmic labor, the sound of the blade scraping against the timber, providing a soothing background to her gentle movements. When the cabin was entirely tidy, Evelyn returned to her ashwood chair near the fire. She reached into the deep pocket of the oversized red flannel and retrieved the smooth wooden comb Silas had purchased for her. She pulled the wooden pin from her auburn hair, letting the heavy locks cascade down her back. She began to draw the comb slowly through the tangled strands. The firelight danced across the room, casting a warm, golden glow over her delicate features. Silas paused his carving. He remained in the deep shadows of his workbench, perfectly still. He watched the gentle, mesmerizing motion of her hand as she combed her long hair. The cabin, which had been his solitary fortress for so many long years, suddenly felt entirely different. It felt vibrant, infused with a soft, undeniable grace that he had never known he lacked. It was the third warmth beat, a quiet realization washing over the stoic mountain man. He watched the firelight illuminate the pale column of her throat and the soft curve of her jaw. The deep, protective instinct he harbored was slowly evolving into something far more dangerous. He found himself cataloging the subtle details of her presence, the exact shade of her amber eyes, the soft sound of her breathing, the way she tucked her chin into her shawl. The absolute solitude he had always cherished now felt deeply hollow when she was not moving within his line of sight. As he watched her staring peacefully into the glowing embers, a heavy, unfamiliar ache settled deep within his broad chest. Is Silas beginning to feel a longing for more than just a houseguest? The frost upon the window panes formed thick, intricate patterns resembling the delicate lace of a forgotten world. Inside the sturdy walls of the mountain cabin, the morning routine unfolded in a slow, peaceful dance of domestic quiet. Evelyn stood near her perfectly carved ash wood chair, the heavy green shawl draped securely over the oversized red flannel shirt. She felt a strange, profound lightness in her limbs. The terrifying shadows of her past were slowly losing their suffocating grip, replaced by the steady, predictable rhythms of the mountain giant. She walked toward the large wooden chest, resting near the heavy timber door. She intended to neatly fold the heavy winter coat that had served as her desperate shroud during the brutal blizzard. The coat was a terrifying reminder of the freezing death she had barely escaped. As she lifted the heavy wool garment, her pale fingers brushed against a deep, hidden pocket inside the dark lining. She needed to retrieve the single item she had carried from her previous life, a dangerous anchor to the monster she had fled. She pulled a folded, heavily tattered piece of parchment from the deep pocket. The edges were worn completely soft from frantic handling, the paper stained with the dirt of a long, desperate journey. She intended to transfer the hidden document to the pocket of the red flannel shirt. However, the heavy wool of the winter coat slipped clumsily from her grasp. She lunged forward to catch the falling garment. The sudden, frantic movement caused her pale fingers to open. The tattered parchment fluttered through the warm air of the cabin, landing directly upon the floorboards with a soft, crisp whisper. The paper came to rest exactly 3 paces away, landing just inches from the heavy leather boots of the mountain man. Silas immediately ceased his steady labor at the wooden workbench. The rhythmic scraping of his iron knife vanished, leaving a sudden, ringing silence in the small room. He looked down at the floorboards. The folded parchment rested starkly against the dark wood. The heavy wax seal holding the paper closed was cracked, but the deep red color was undeniably visible. He recognized the nature of the object instantly. It was a formal letter, a tangible piece of the dark, violent history she guarded so fiercely. Evelyn froze completely. The air entirely vanished from her lungs. A cold, absolute terror seized her fragile frame. She stared at the tattered letter resting near the feet of the giant. The document contained the absolute truth of her desperate flight. It contained names, locations, and the horrifying reality of the danger she carried. If he picked it up, if he simply unfolded the tattered edges and read the ink within, the fragile illusion of her quiet widowhood would shatter completely. He would know she was a hunted woman, a profound liability that could bring violent death directly to his peaceful sanctuary. She pressed her chin tightly into the soft wool of her green shawl, a subtle recurring habit born of deep panic, her amber eyes wide with raw, anticipating fear. Silas stood perfectly still. He looked at the trembling woman, recognizing the stark, naked panic illuminating her pale features. He understood the immense, terrifying power held within that small square of paper. The harsh wilderness taught him that knowledge was often a weapon. Reading the letter would give him total control over her secrets. It would satisfy the burning, protective curiosity thrumming deep within his broad chest. He wanted desperately to know the name of the monster who had painted the horrific bruises across her delicate collarbone. He wanted a clear target for the fierce anger simmering in his blood. He knelt very slowly upon the wooden floorboards. He reached out with his massive, calloused hand. His thick fingers grasped the edge of the parchment. Evelyn squeezed her eyes shut. She braced herself for the inevitable shift in the dynamic, waiting for the heavy, judging questions to begin. She waited for the mountain man to demand the truth. The demand never arrived. Instead of unfolding the paper, Silas stood to his full, towering height. He kept the letter pinched lightly between his rough thumb and forefinger. He did not look at the heavy red wax seal. He did not attempt to peek at the faded ink. He turned his head away, deliberately, fixing his flint blue eyes entirely upon the glowing embers of the stone hearth. He extended his massive arm across the open space, offering the hidden secret back to her without a single condition. It was the first warmth beat of the morning, a profound demonstration of absolute integrity. Evelyn opened her amber eyes. She stared at the heavy hand holding the folded parchment. The sheer, overwhelming honor of the man struck her bruised heart with the physical force of a tidal wave. In the dark halls of her past, secrets were heavily traded, exploited, and used as tools of brutal manipulation. Yet, this terrifying giant held the ultimate weapon of her destruction, and he actively refused to look at it. She stepped forward with trembling legs. She reached out and took the tattered letter from his thick fingers. The brief, accidental brush of her pale skin against his rough knuckles sent a sudden, shocking spark of warmth rushing up her arm. She clutched the parchment tightly against her chest, right over her wildly beating heart. "Thank you," she breathed softly, the two small words carrying the immense, crushing weight of 1,000 unspoken fears. Silas simply nodded once. He turned his broad back toward her, walking directly to the hearth. He picked up a thick iron poker and stirred the embers, placing a new, heavy log directly into the center of the flames. He specifically arranged the wood to ensure the radiant heat would immediately warm the exact spot where she stood shivering. It was the second warmth beat, a quiet reassurance that nothing had changed between them. The sanctuary remained perfectly intact. He returned to his wooden workbench, but not before pausing at the long table. He poured a small tin cup of hot, steaming water from the iron kettle and placed it gently upon the small stool near her ashwood chair. It was the third warmth beat, a silent offering to soothe the lingering shock trembling within her delicate frame. The steady, predictable rhythm of the iron blade against the timber resumed. The sound was incredibly grounding, a beautiful melody of safety. Evelyn walked back to her ash wood chair. She slipped the tattered letter deeply into the pocket of the red flannel shirt. She sat down, pulling the green shawl tightly around her delicate frame. A deep, highly meaningful emotional reflection washed over her tired mind. The profound respect he had just demonstrated fundamentally altered the landscape of her battered soul. She did not simply rely upon him for physical protection anymore. She realized, with a sudden and breathtaking clarity, that she trusted him entirely. The deep, agonizing fear of his immense strength was completely gone, replaced by a profound, blooming admiration. The fierce attachment she felt to the silent guardian was growing far beyond simple gratitude. Silas continued to carve the pale ash wood. However, his mind was entirely consumed by the brief, terrifying flash of panic he had witnessed in the amber eyes of the woman. The tattered letter was incredibly old, handled with a desperate frequency that suggested a deep, enduring trauma. The simple story of a helpless widow caught in a tragic blizzard was unraveling rapidly within his sharp mind. The heavy bruises, the instinctive flinching, and the deep terror surrounding a simple piece of paper pointed to a much darker, calculated pursuit. He would honor her silence absolutely. He would never force her to speak the painful words. But the fierce guardian instinct, roaring within his massive chest, demanded immediate preparation. The fierce winter storm had passed, but an entirely different kind of darkness was inevitably tracking her through the high rocks. What does the letter contain? And does Silas suspect the truth? The piece of the mountain was a fragile, temporary illusion. The deep, heavy silence of the afternoon shattered violently. The sharp, rhythmic crunch of iron horseshoes striking the frozen earth echoed loudly through the high rocks. Silas stood immediately from the wooden workbench. The massive frame of the man grew entirely rigid. He turned his head toward the heavy timber door, his flint-blue eyes narrowing into cold, dangerous slits. Evelyn gasped. She scrambled out of the perfectly carved ash wood chair, her small boots sliding slightly upon the smooth floorboards. She retreated frantically into the deepest shadows of the far corner, squeezing her delicate frame between the heavy flour barrel and the rough log wall. She pulled the thick green shawl tightly across her chest. She tucked her chin deeply into the heavy wool, an instinctive, desperate gesture to hide her vulnerable throat. The terrifying monster of her past was suddenly very near. A loud, heavy fist pounded upon the thick wood of the door. The aggressive sound was an absolute violation of their sanctuary. Silas did not hesitate. He moved toward the entrance with terrifying, silent speed. He paused for one brief second. He looked toward the dark corner, where the woman huddled. He raised his massive hand, offering a slow gesture that demanded absolute silence. Then, he performed the first warmth beat of the hour. He positioned his broad shoulders deliberately, ensuring his massive body would completely block any possible line of sight into the cabin. He lifted the heavy iron bolt. He pulled the door open. A harsh gust of frigid wind rushed into the room, bringing the pungent, sharp scent of unwashed leather, wet horsehair, and stale tobacco. A stranger stood upon the threshold. The man wore a heavy canvas duster and a silver star pinned to his chest. He was a lawman from the distant territories, a hunter of men who looked exhausted and highly agitated. "Good afternoon to you," the lawman barked, his voice rough and demanding. "I am tracking a fugitive." Silas did not move. He filled the entire doorway, a wall of living granite. He stared down at the stranger, his expression entirely unreadable. "You are far from the valley roads," Silas rumbled, his tone flat and unyielding. "There is nothing up here but rock and ice." "I am looking for a woman," the lawman countered, pulling a folded piece of thick parchment from the pocket of his coat. "She is a runaway. She has auburn hair, pale skin, and stands no taller than my chest. She is the wife of a very powerful gentleman from the eastern cities." The single word struck the air like a physical blow. Wife. In the dark corner of the cabin, the heart of Evelyn stopped beating completely. The breath evaporated entirely from her lungs. The fragile, delicate lie of her widowhood shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces upon the wooden floorboards. She was not a tragic widow seeking a quiet, fresh start. She was the legal property of a violent tyrant. The law of the land demanded her immediate return to the heavy hands that had painted the horrific bruises upon her flesh. "The husband of the woman is offering a massive reward," the lawman continued, completely oblivious to the intense, terrifying silence of the giant standing before him. "She is dangerous. She stole a highly sensitive document from the private safe of her husband, a document that could ruin him entirely if it ever reached the hands of a judge." The man will never stop hunting her. He will burn every town in this territory to find her. Have you seen her pass this way? Silas looked at the parchment in the hand of the stranger. He understood the profound, deadly shift in the paradigm. The woman hiding in the shadows of his home was not simply running from a bad memory. She was actively hunted by a wealthy, powerful force with the full backing of the law. The danger was not a ghost. The danger was real, heavily funded, and closing in rapidly. Silas shifted his weight. He looked the lawman directly in the eye. He delivered the second warmth beat without a single tremor of hesitation. No, Silas answered, his deep voice carrying the absolute, unquestionable weight of a mountain stone. No one passes this high in the winter. The blizzards kill anyone foolish enough to try. If your fugitive came up this mountain, the wolves have already scattered her bones. The lawman shivered heavily in the freezing draft. He looked at the vast, desolate white wilderness surrounding the cabin. He nodded slowly, accepting the stark, brutal logic of the mountain man. I suppose you speak the truth, the lawman muttered, turning away from the threshold. A fragile thing like her would never survive a single night in this hell. I will take my search back to the southern rails. Silas watched the man mount his horse. He waited until the heavy hooves disappeared completely down the steep, icy trail. He stepped back into the cabin. He pushed the heavy timber door shut. He slid the iron bolt home with a loud, definitive clash. The silence inside the room was entirely different now. It was not the comfortable, peaceful quiet of shared labor. It was a heavy, suffocating silence filled with exposed secrets and raw, naked truth. Evelyn remained in the dark corner. She was trembling so violently that her teeth chattered together. The profound emotional reflection crashed over her fragile mind with devastating force. She thought about the heavy, desperate days of her flight. The endless train rides. The cold nights hiding in dirty alleyways. The constant, sickening fear of a heavy hand falling upon her shoulder. She had believed the identity of a grieving widow would shield her from the probing questions of the world. But the reach of her violent husband was far longer and much darker than she had ever imagined. The deep, intense vulnerability of her position was absolute. The mountain giant now knew the truth. She had brought a deadly, relentless threat directly to his peaceful door. She was a liar. She was a hunted fugitive. She expected him to drag her outside by her wrist. She expected him to cast her into the freezing snow to protect his own life. She closed her amber eyes, waiting for the heavy, furious footsteps to approach her corner. She waited for the harsh demand to leave. The demand never arrived. Silas turned away from the heavy door. He did not look toward the dark corner. He did not march across the room in a fit of righteous anger. Instead, he delivered the third warmth beat of the hour. He walked with slow, measured steps directly to the stone hearth. He picked up the heavy iron poker. He began to tend the fire, keeping his broad back turned completely toward her. He offered her the absolute physical space to process her terrifying exposure without the suffocating weight of his direct gaze. The massive hands of the mountain man were perfectly steady as he arranged the glowing logs. However, a terrifying, quiet storm was brewing deep within his broad chest. He understood the nature of the document hidden in the pocket of her red flannel shirt. The tattered letter she guarded with her life was the key to her freedom, or the absolute guarantee of her death. He did not care about the law. He did not care about the wealth of the husband. He only cared about the terrified woman weeping silently in the shadows of his home. Evelyn opened her eyes. She watched the broad back of the silent guardian. He had lied to the lawman. He had actively defied the law of the land to protect a stranger who had completely deceived him. The tears finally spilled over her pale eyelashes, tracking silently down her cheeks. The fragile lie was gone. The brutal truth was exposed. How will Silas react now that he knows she was never a widow? The tears of Evelyn fell with absolute silence. She remained pressed entirely into the dark corner of the cabin, the rough timber of the wall biting through the heavy red flannel. The lie was exposed. The terrifying truth of her identity hung in the warm air, heavy and suffocating. She watched the broad back of Silas as he tended the fire. The glowing embers cast long, dancing shadows across the massive shoulders of the man. She waited for the inevitable explosion of anger. She waited for the heavy hand to grab her fragile arm and cast her out into the freezing wilderness. Silas placed the iron poker against the stone hearth. The metallic clink sounded like a judge striking a heavy gavel. He turned around very slowly. The flint blue eyes of the mountain man were incredibly dark, filled with a storm of quiet intensity. He did not march toward her in a fit of righteous fury. He walked toward the long wooden table. He picked up a fresh tin cup, pouring a measure of warm, sweet tea from the iron kettle. He walked toward the dark corner with slow, heavily measured steps. He stopped 2 paces away. He knelt upon the wooden floorboards, lowering his towering frame until he was perfectly level with her terrified gaze. He placed the tin cup gently upon the floor. It was the first warmth beat of the hour, a deliberate offering of physical comfort intended to ground her frantic, racing mind. Evelyn stared at the rising steam. Her small hands trembled violently as she clutched the edges of the green shawl. She tucked her chin deeply into the thick wool, the subtle, recurring habit of defense taking complete control over her fragile body. She looked at the hardened face of the giant. "You lied to the law," she whispered, her voice cracking beneath the immense weight of the revelation. "You defied the badge to hide a fugitive." Silas remained perfectly still upon the floorboards. He looked at the pale, tear-stained face of the woman. He saw the raw, absolute terror vibrating within her delicate frame. "The law of the valley is a heavy tool," Silas rumbled softly, his deep voice carrying the unyielding strength of ancient stone. "Cruel men use that tool to break fragile things. The paper they carry holds no true honor. I do not answer to the paper of the valley." The breath caught sharply within the throat of Evelyn. She shook her head, the heavy auburn locks falling around her pale face. "You do not understand the reach of the man," she breathed, the panic rising rapidly within her chest. "The husband of mine is a man of immense wealth. He owns the courts. He owns the iron rails. He buys the souls of men with Eastern gold. He will never stop hunting the document I carry. He will burn this entire mountain to the ground, just to see me punished for running." The silence returned to the small cabin. It was a heavy, pregnant pause. Silas did not demand to see the tattered letter. He did not ask for the intricate details of the document. He asked for only one thing. "Tell me the name of the monster," Silas commanded quietly. Evelyn closed her amber eyes. The mere thought of the name brought a fresh wave of sickening terror to her bruised heart. "Elias Thorne." Silas repeated the name softly, locking the syllables deep within his mind. He leaned forward slightly, closing the distance just enough to ensure she heard the absolute, terrifying resolve vibrating in his tone. "Elias Thorne is a king of the dirt roads," Silas stated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "But the gold of the eastern cities cannot buy the freezing wind. The judges of the valley cannot command the heavy snow. The reach of Elias Thorn ends exactly at the base of this mountain. If the men of the valley come up the high rocks seeking blood, they will find only the deep, silent graves of the wilderness. You will remain within these timber walls. You are entirely safe here. It was the second warmth beat. It was a profound, unbreakable vow of vengeance and protection. He did not offer hollow words of comfort. He offered the terrifying, absolute promise of a guardian, willing to wage a bloody war against the entire world to preserve her fragile dignity. A profound emotional reflection washed over the tired mind of Evelyn. The tears flowed freely down her pale cheeks. She had spent 2 long years in a state of constant, suffocating isolation. She had believed she must face the darkness of the world entirely alone. Yet, sitting upon the floorboards of the remote cabin, she realized the sheer, overwhelming depth of her emotional dependence upon the silent giant. He was no longer simply a kind stranger. He was the sturdy foundation upon which her very existence now rested. The fierce loyalty of the mountain man was a beautiful, terrifying anchor. She leaned slightly forward, bowing her head as a quiet sob escaped her lips, the heavy knot of fear finally beginning to unravel. Silas stood slowly. He looked down at the weeping woman, a fierce, protective ache tightening his broad chest. He turned away to grant her the dignity of private tears. He walked directly to the heavy wooden mantel resting high above the stone hearth. He reached up with his massive hands and retrieved a long, incredibly heavy rifle. The blued steel of the weapon gleamed coldly in the warm firelight. He carried the heavy gun to the wooden workbench. He retrieved a small tin of dark gun oil and a square of clean cotton cloth. He sat upon his large stool. He began to meticulously clean the intricate mechanism of the lever-action rifle. The sharp, pungent aroma of the gun oil immediately cut through the sweet scent of the burning cedar. It was a vivid sensory moment, blending the comforting atmosphere of the home with the harsh, metallic reality of impending violence. The rhythmic sound of the metal sliding against metal filled the quiet room. Click, clack, knocked. The mechanical noise was inherently terrifying. Yet, to Evelyn, it sounded like a beautiful, deeply comforting melody. It was the third warmth beat of the hour. The giant was not cleaning the weapon to threaten her. He was preparing the heavy steel to ensure the nightmare of her past could never touch her again. He worked in total silence. His flint blue eyes focused intensely upon the oiled steel. The fierce vow of protection was absolute. However, the shadow of Elias Thorn was long, heavy, and heavily funded by boundless wealth. The lawman would report the empty trails, but a tyrant obsessed with a stolen secret would never accept defeat. The Eastern gold would eventually buy more desperate, violent men willing to brave the harsh blizzards of the high rocks. The silent guardian possessed an immense physical strength, but he was only one mortal man standing against an empire of cruelty. Is Silas putting his own life at risk by shielding her? The profound exhaustion of the day finally claimed the trembling body of Evelyn. The heavy iron bolt secured the timber door, and the massive lever-action rifle rested fully loaded upon the long wooden table. The cabin was a fortress, utterly impervious to the freezing wind of the mountain. She lay upon a thick pallet of heavy wolf pelts near the glowing stone hearth. The warmth of the fire wrapped completely around her fragile frame. The oversized red flannel shirt shielded her pale skin, and the thick green woolen shawl rested heavily over her legs. She closed her amber eyes. The steady, predictable breathing of the mountain giant lulling her toward the necessary oblivion of sleep. However, the deep sanctuary of the physical world could not protect her from the dark, terrifying landscape of her own mind. The sleep brought no peace. It brought only a violent return to the gilded cage she had desperately fled. The nightmare began with the chilling, hollow sound of polished leather shoes striking cold marble stairs. The grand eastern mansion of Elias Thorne was a palace of absolute silence and suffocating dread. In the dream, Evelyn ran through endless, heavily shadowed corridors. She wore the delicate silk bodice, but the fabric offered absolutely no warmth. The air was unnaturally cold, smelling sharply of expensive cologne and stale cigar smoke. The distant, measured footsteps followed her relentlessly. She reached a large, ornate door. She twisted the brass handle with frantic, desperate strength. The door was locked tight. The shadow of the cruel husband fell completely over her trembling form. Soft, immaculately clean hands reached out from the darkness, wrapping, with sudden, brutal force around her delicate throat. The air vanished completely. The world faded into a terrifying, suffocating black void. Evelyn tore herself violently from the grip of the nightmare. With a sharp, shattered scream, she scrambled upright upon the heavy wolf pelts, her pale hands clawing frantically at the collar of the red flannel shirt. She gasped for air, her lungs burning fiercely. The cabin was entirely dark, save for the weak, dying embers of the hearth. For a terrifying, disorienting moment, she did not know where she was. The deep shadows of the room looked exactly like the locked, suffocating corners of the eastern mansion. The phantom grip of the tyrant still burned intensely upon her bruised collarbone. A sudden, bright spark snapped sharply in the dark. The warm, golden light of an oil lantern bloomed rapidly, pushing the terrifying shadows completely into the far corners of the room. Silas stood exactly 3 paces away. He held the glass globe of the lantern high, the gentle light illuminating the rough, weathered lines of his stoic face. He wore only his canvas trousers and a thick woolen undershirt, having risen instantly from his own bed at the very first sound of her distress. He did not rush forward to grab her. He knew intimately that sudden physical contact would only deeply terrify a soul caught in the grips of a violent memory. He simply stood like a heavy lighthouse in the storm, allowing her frantic, searching gaze to find him. "The shadows are empty," Silas rumbled softly, his deep voice incredibly steady and profoundly grounding. "You are entirely safe within these walls." Evelyn stared at the towering mountain man. She recognized the scent of the sweet burning cedar and the faint, lingering aroma of the dark gun oil. The horrific reality of the nightmare began to slowly recede, replaced entirely by the undeniable, physical truth of the safe sanctuary. She pulled her knees tightly to her chest, wrapping the thick green shawl around her shaking shoulders. She tucked her chin deeply into the rough wool, the subtle, recurring habit returning in full force as the cold sweat chilled her pale skin. "He was here," she whispered, her voice a broken, jagged rasp. "The hands of the monster were upon my throat. The darkness of that house never truly leaves my mind." Silas lowered the oil lantern slowly. He placed the heavy brass base onto the floorboards. He walked deliberately to the iron kettle, resting near the warm hearthstones. He poured a small amount of the lukewarm water into a tin cup. He approached her resting place with slow, exceptionally careful steps. He knelt upon the wooden floorboards, extending his massive, calloused hand to offer the drink. It was the first warmth beat of the long night. The simple offering required her to reach out, bridging the physical gap between them with a tiny gesture of absolute trust. Evelyn took the tin cup. The accidental brush of her pale fingers against his rough knuckles sent a deep, sudden spark of warmth traveling rapidly up her arm. She drank the water, the liquid soothing her raw, burning throat. She looked into the flint blue eyes of the giant. The fierce, terrifying anger he had displayed during the visit of the lawman was completely gone. In its place was a profound, deep well of protective sorrow. He looked at the bruised woman, entirely understanding the absolute devastation wrought by a cruel, possessive hand. "The wounds upon the skin eventually fade," Silas murmured, taking the empty cup from her trembling fingers. "The wounds of the mind bleed for a much longer season. The healing of a shattered spirit requires the passage of heavy time." He stood to his full, towering height. He walked to the center of the room. He picked up the perfectly carved ash wood chair, the specific chair he had built exclusively for her small frame. He carried the wooden furniture back to her resting place. He set the chair down exactly beside the edge of the heavy wolf pelts. He did not return to his own bed across the room. He sat down heavily upon the ash wood seat. He reached out and picked up the massive, lever-action rifle he had carefully cleaned earlier in the evening. He laid the heavy blued steel gently across his broad knees. It was the second warmth beat. It was a silent, overwhelmingly powerful declaration. He was actively refusing to leave her alone in the dark. "Close your eyes," he commanded softly, resting his thick hands lightly upon the wooden stock of the weapon. "I will watch the timber door. The darkness cannot enter this room while I draw breath." Evelyn stared at the massive art guardian sitting faithfully beside her bed. The profound emotional reflection swelled beautifully within her battered chest. In the cruel world of her past, the presence of a man during the night was a terrifying guarantee of pain and deep humiliation. Yet, the towering giant sitting beside her offered only absolute safety and respectful, unbroken distance. The steady rhythm of his breathing was an incredible lullaby, deeply soothing the lingering trauma of the nightmare. She lay back down upon the thick pelts. Silas reached out, pulling the edge of the heavy green shawl carefully over her shoulders to ensure the freezing draft could not touch her pale skin. It was the third warmth beat, a gentle, domestic gesture that deeply contrasted the violent capability of the rifle resting upon his lap. The profound, increasing intimacy of the moment was undeniably powerful. She felt entirely shielded from the physical dangers of the world. The massive guardian was a permanent, unyielding wall between her and the wrath of Elias Thorne. The fierce loyalty of the mountain man filled her broken heart with a strange, beautiful longing. However, as she looked at the calloused hands holding the heavy steel, the deep, ugly shame of her ruined body flared brightly within her mind. She wore the oversized red flannel to hide the horrific bruises, the terrible proof that she was a damaged, broken thing. He offered her total protection, but she firmly believed she was entirely unworthy of his gentle devotion. The physical danger was locked outside, but the internal cage remained securely fastened. Can she let go of the shame that keeps her distant? The pale, gray light of the winter dawn crept very slowly through the heavy frost of the window panes. The long, terrifying night was finally over, but the deep exhaustion resting upon the small cabin was entirely suffocating. Silas remained perfectly still upon the carved ash wood chair. He had not closed his flint blue eyes for a single moment. The heavy blued steel of the lever-action rifle remained resting securely across his broad knees. He watched the chest of the fragile woman rise and fall in the steady rhythm of deep sleep. He stood slowly, his massive frame completely silent despite the stiff chill in his muscles. He walked to the stone hearth. He placed fresh wood upon the glowing embers, moving with deliberate, quiet care. He reached for the iron kettle and a small tin of ground coffee beans. He began to brew the dark liquid. The rich, bitter aroma, mixing heavily with the sweet scent of the burning cedar. It was a vivid sensory moment. The sharp smell of the coffee, anchoring the room in the harsh reality of the morning. When the brew was ready, he poured a tin cup. He also placed a thick slice of dried apple bread upon a small wooden plate. He carried the food and the warm drink directly to the edge of the heavy wolf pelts. It was the first warmth beat of the morning. A silent, dedicated provision of sustenance following a night of profound terror. Evelyn stirred slowly beneath the thick green shawl. She opened her amber eyes, blinking against the pale light. The terrifying memories of the shadowed mansion lingered briefly at the very edges of her mind. But the immediate, physical sight of the towering guardian completely banished the lingering darkness. She sat upright, pulling the oversized red flannel shirt tightly around her delicate frame. She accepted the tin cup with trembling fingers. The hot coffee warmed her pale hands, offering a small measure of comfort against the biting chill of the room. "The sun is awake," Silas rumbled softly, his deep voice carrying a gentle, steady cadence. "The storm has fully passed. The high rocks are quiet." The profound peace lasted only for another fleeting moment. The heavy, yes, unnatural silence of the mountain broke completely. The harsh, chaotic crunch of numerous heavy horseshoes striking the frozen, packed snow echoed violently through the crisp air. The sound was not the isolated, singular approach of a lone lawman. It was the heavy, coordinated movement of a small, heavily armed group. Evelyn froze completely. The tin cup rattled loudly against the wooden plate. The breath vanished entirely from her lungs. She tucked her delicate chin deeply into the thick wool of the green shawl, the deeply ingrained habit of defense seizing her fragile body with absolute force. The terrifying reach of Elias Thorne had finally arrived. The immense wealth of the cruel husband had successfully purchased violent men willing to brave the deadly ice to reclaim his stolen property. Silas turned his massive head toward the heavy timber door. The flint-blue eyes of the mountain man hardened instantly into chips of pure, unbreakable ice. He reached down and scooped the heavy lever-action rifle from the chair. He checked the mechanism with a sharp, mechanical click. "Move away from the window," Silas commanded. His voice was completely devoid of any warmth. It was the absolute, terrifying tone of a warrior preparing for immediate bloodshed. He walked directly to the center of the wooden floorboards. He kicked the heavy woven rug aside. He reached down and grabbed an iron ring completely flush with the timber floor. He pulled upward with immense, singular strength. A heavy, concealed trapdoor swung open, revealing the dark, cold depths of a deep root cellar dug directly into the frozen earth of the mountain. Silas turned toward Evelyn. He extended his massive, calloused hand toward the dark opening. It was the second warmth beat. He had specifically prepared a hidden, impenetrable fortress beneath the floorboards to ensure the violent men of the valley could never lay eyes upon her trembling form. "Climb down," he instructed firmly, leaving absolutely no room for hesitation. "Do not make a single sound. Do not come out until I lift the timber." Evelyn scrambled off the heavy wolf pelts. Her legs shook violently as she moved toward the center of the room. She looked down into the pitch-black void of the cellar. The cold, earthy scent of the deep dirt rose from the darkness. She placed her small boots upon the wooden rungs of the ladder. She descended slowly into the freezing shadows. She paused before her head dropped below the level of the floorboards. She looked up at the towering giant standing above her. The massive shoulders of the man completely blocked the light of the cabin. The heavy rifle resting in his hands looked terrifyingly lethal. A profound, agonizing emotional reflection crashed completely over her bruised heart. The true, devastating cost of protection was suddenly visible. The silent guardian was preparing to wage a bloody war against multiple armed mercenaries, solely to preserve the dignity of a broken runaway. She was the direct cause of this violence. She had dragged the suffocating darkness of her past directly into the pure, clean sanctuary of the high rocks. If the giant fell upon the floorboards today, the blood of an innocent, honorable man would forever stain her hands. A terrible, suffocating fear of loss seized her chest. She realized with absolute clarity that she cared for the life of the silent guardian far more than she cared for her own freedom. "They will kill you," she whispered, her voice cracking beneath the weight of her immense regret. "There are too many riders. You must give me to them. You cannot die for my sins." Silas knelt quickly upon the edge of the opening. He looked down into the terrified amber eyes of the woman. He reached out his thick, calloused fingers. He gently brushed a stray lock of auburn hair away from her pale cheek. It was the third warmth beat, a breathtaking gesture of profound tenderness, executed directly upon the terrifying threshold of violence. "I have lived 1,000 lifetimes in the quiet dark," Silas murmured, the fierce loyalty burning brightly within his gaze. "I will gladly trade the remainder of my days to ensure the monster of the eastern cities never touches your skin again. Wait in the dark. I will hold the door." He released the heavy timber trapdoor. The thick wood slammed shut with a heavy, definitive thud, plunging Evelyn into absolute, terrifying blackness. The heavy boots of the riders hit the wooden porch of the cabin. The loud, chaotic voices filtered through the thick logs. The men were angry, frozen, and deeply motivated by the promise of endless gold. "We know the runaway is inside the cabin," a coarse voice shouted through the heavy timber door. "The husband pays handsomely for the return of the property." "Open the lock, mountain man. We have 10 guns pointed at the windows. You cannot stand against the money of Elias Thorne." Evelyn pressed her trembling hands against her ears in the pitch-black cellar. The freezing dirt smelled of old roots and deep sorrow. She heard the heavy iron bolt of the front door slide open. Silas stepped entirely out onto the wooden porch. He pulled the door shut behind him. He faced the heavily armed men of the valley. The wind howled sharply through the frozen trees. Short sentences. High tension. The men raised the heavy barrels of their weapons. Silas did not flinch. He raised the stock of the lever-action rifle to his broad shoulder. "This mountain is closed," Silas rumbled. A sudden, deafening roar of a heavy firearm completely shattered the quiet morning. The violent sound echoed endlessly through the high rocks, followed instantly by the heavy thud of a massive body hitting the wooden planks of the porch. Evelyn screamed silently in the dark. Will Silas survive the encounter? The deafening roar of the heavy firearm faded into a terrible, ringing silence. Deep within the freezing dirt of the root cellar, Evelyn squeezed her amber eyes tightly shut. She covered her ears with her trembling, pale hands. The sharp smell of the old roots mixed with the sudden, metallic tang of absolute terror. She waited for the heavy sound of boots breaking down the front timber door. She waited for the violent hands of the mercenaries to drag her screaming from the dark. And instead, the chaotic voices of the men filtered through the heavy timber floorboards. The voices were filled with raw panic, not violent triumph. The eastern gold of Elias Thorne could buy many things, but it could not buy the courage to face a mountain giant entirely willing to unleash absolute destruction. The harsh, Frantic sound of heavy horseshoes scraping wildly against the ice signaled a desperate, terrified retreat. The hired riders were fleeing back down the steep trails, leaving the high rocks entirely behind. Then, with the profound silence returned. It was not the peaceful quiet of the morning. It was a heavy, suffocating stillness. Evelyn remained clinging to the wooden ladder. She waited for the massive hands of the guardian to lift the heavy trapdoor. She waited for his deep, rumbling voice to declare the sanctuary safe. The call never came. The fear of loss, sharp and deeply agonizing, pierced her bruised heart. She pushed upward against the heavy timber trapdoor with both of her small hands. The wood groaned loudly, shifting just enough to let the pale light of the cabin spill into the dark cellar. She climbed out onto the wooden floorboards. The sight before her shattered the remainder of her fragile world. Silas rested heavily against the thick timber of the front door. The massive lever-action rifle lay discarded upon the woven rug. The breathing of the giant was extremely shallow, jagged, and wet. A large, spreading stain of dark crimson soaked entirely through the thick canvas of his coat, located just beneath his broad left shoulder. He had taken the fire of the mercenaries, using his own massive body as a final, unbreakable shield to ensure they could never cross the threshold. It was the first warmth beat. Even in his profound agony, his only action, after taking the heavy bullet, was to slide the heavy iron bolt completely shut, locking the danger outside the sanctuary forever before his tremendous strength failed him. Evelyn gasped, the terrifying sound tearing violently from her throat. Her immediate, deeply ingrained instinct demanded she retreat from the violence. She reached frantically for the thick green shawl resting upon her shoulders, pulling the wool tightly around her delicate neck, tucking her chin downward to hide from the terrifying sight of the blood. She was a broken thing, entirely incapable of facing the brutal, physical damage of the world. But as she looked at the pale, sweating face of the silent guardian, a massive paradigm shift occurred within her battered soul. The man bleeding upon the floorboards had risked absolutely everything to preserve her dignity. He was dying to protect a woman he barely knew. The fragile persona of the weeping widow evaporated completely. Evelyn dropped the heavy green shawl intentionally onto the floorboards. She pulled the oversized red flannel shirt over her head, discarding the thick fabric entirely. She stood in the freezing air of the cabin, wearing only the ruined, torn silk bodice of her past life. The horrific bruises upon her delicate collarbone were fully exposed, but she no longer felt the suffocating weight of the deep shame. She felt only a fierce, terrifying surge of absolute determination. She rushed directly toward the heavy timber door. She knelt perfectly beside the fallen giant. "You must move," she commanded, her voice completely stripped of its usual trembling fear. "You cannot rest upon the cold floor." Silas opened his flint blue eyes. He looked at the delicate woman, his vision blurring heavily at the edges. He saw the naked determination burning brightly within her amber gaze. He gave a single, slow nod. With agonizing slowness, she placed her small shoulder directly beneath his massive right arm. She braced her delicate legs against the floorboards. She pulled upward with a shocking, desperate strength she never knew she possessed. The giant assisted her as much as his failing body allowed. Together, they stumbled across the small room, collapsing heavily onto the thick wolf pelts near the glowing stone hearth. Evelyn did not pause to catch her breath. She moved with blinding, purposeful speed. She grabbed the iron kettle and pushed it directly into the hottest center of the glowing embers. She retrieved the small tin basin and the sliver of pine soap. She returned immediately to the resting place of the giant. She reached down and grasped the hem of her expensive, ruined silk bodice. The garment was the very last physical tie to the wealthy, cruel empire of Elias Thorne. With a fierce, violent pull, she tore the delicate fabric completely in half. She created long, clean strips of white silk to serve as bandages. It was the second warmth beat. She was actively destroying the dark symbol of her past trauma to bind the deep wounds of her present salvation. She opened the heavy canvas coat of the man. She cleaned the dark crimson from his pale skin with the warm water and the pine soap. The harsh smell of the copper completely overwhelmed the fresh pine. A vivid sensory moment, anchoring her firmly to the desperate, bloody task. The heavy lead of the bullet had passed completely through the thick muscle of his shoulder, miraculously missing the vital bone. But the bleeding was intense and incredibly dangerous. She pressed the folded strips of silk directly against the wound, leaning her entire body weight against his broad chest to stop the heavy flow. "Press the cloth," she breathed, her pale hands completely slick with the warm liquid. "Hold the pressure tightly." Silas raised his heavy right hand. He covered her trembling fingers with his massive, calloused palm, pressing the soft silk firmly against his own torn flesh. The silence of the room was broken only by the quiet crackle of the fire, and their ragged, exhausted breathing. Evelyn sat back slowly upon her heels. Her pale face was heavily smeared with dark soot and the blood of the mountain man. Her auburn hair hung in wild tangles around her exposed, heavily bruised shoulders. She was no longer the fragile, terrified runaway seeking a dark corner to hide. She was a fierce, protective force of nature, entirely forged in the roaring fires of deep adversity. Silas looked quietly at the remarkable transformation. He reached up with his uninjured hand. He did not attempt to pull his heavy coat closed. He did not ask for the red flannel to cover her bruises. Instead, he gently touched the smooth wooden comb, resting loosely within the tangled strands of her auburn hair. "The mountain did not break you," Silas whispered, his deep voice a weak, vibrating rumble of absolute certainty. "The eastern city tried to completely crush the spirit, but the core of the timber is absolute iron." It was the third warmth beat. He saw the horrific, ugly bruises marking her delicate skin, yet he completely ignored the damage, choosing instead to validate the immense, breathtaking strength she had just displayed to save his life. Evelyn closed her eyes, leaning her soft cheek gently against the rough knuckles of his massive hand. The deep emotional reflection settled heavily into her weary bones. The profound strength she had desperately searched for was never hidden within the distant miles of the iron rails. The immense courage she needed was found entirely in the pure, unselfish act of loving another human being. She had saved the life of the guardian, completely reversing the roles of their fragile existence. However, as the bleeding finally slowed to a halt, and the giant drifted slowly into a heavy, exhausted slumber, the terrible reality of the situation crashed completely over her tired mind. The mercenaries had fled the high rocks, but they would return directly to the valley. They would send a dark message to the eastern cities. Elias Thorne would eventually send an entire army of violent men to tear the mountain apart stone by stone until he reclaimed his property. She looked at the crimson blood deeply staining her pale hands. The silent guardian was broken, entirely because he had chosen to shelter a cursed, hunted woman. The deep, suffocating guilt gripped her throat like a physical hand. Does she regret bringing this danger to his door? The deep shadows of the mountain night returned to reclaim the small cabin. The storm of violence had completely passed, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating silence. Evelyn knelt beside the tin basin, resting upon the wooden floorboards. She plunged her pale hands into the lukewarm water. The clear liquid instantly bloomed with a dark, cloudy pink. The metallic, sharp aroma of the copper blood mingled heavily with the clean scent of the pine soap. It was a vivid sensory moment, a brutal reminder of the terrible price the silent guardian had paid for her fragile safety. She dried her trembling fingers upon a clean square of cotton. She looked toward the heavy wolf pelts near the glowing stone hearth. Silas lay perfectly still. His breathing was incredibly slow, heavily labored, but steady. The white silk bandages wrapping his broad shoulder were stark against his weathered skin. He was a mountain of a man, brought low entirely by the dark, heavy anchor of her past. Evelyn stood slowly. She retrieved the oversized red flannel shirt from the floorboards. She pulled the thick fabric over her delicate frame, hiding the horrific bruises and the ruined silk bodice once more. She picked up the heavy green woolen shawl, draping the fabric securely over her shoulders. She tucked her delicate chin deeply into the thick wool. It was the subtle, recurring gesture of defense. But she was no longer hiding from the judgment of the giant. She was bracing her fragile heart for the agonizing sacrifice she was about to make. A profound emotional reflection took complete root within her mind. She walked to the carved ash wood chair and sat down to watch his sleeping form. For 2 long years, she had run from the heavy hand of Elias Thorne, seeking only her own survival. She had dragged the deadly pursuit directly to the threshold of a peaceful, honorable man. The giant had bled to defend her. If she remained within the timber walls, the Eastern Gold would eventually purchase 100 more violent men. They would return to the high rocks, and they would not fail a second time. She was absolute poison to his quiet existence. The only way to truly protect the fierce guardian was to remove the target from his home. She must carry the curse of her identity back out into the freezing wilderness. The sacrifice of love demanded a painful, solitary departure. She stood from the ash wood chair. She moved with complete, agonizing silence. She walked to the long wooden table. She gathered a small amount of dried meat and a single flask of fresh water. She did not take the heavy canvas coat of the man, knowing intimately that he would need the absolute warmth while his torn flesh healed. She possessed only the red flannel, the green shawl, and the tattered letter resting heavily within her pocket. It was a meager defense against the brutal cold, but the freezing death of the mountain was far more merciful than the cruel hands of Elias Thorne. Evelyn approached the resting place of the mountain giant one final time. She knelt upon the wooden floorboards, directly beside the heavy wolf pelts. She performed the first warmth beat of the agonizing hour. She reached out with infinite care. She pulled the thick edge of the fur pelt higher over his broad, uninjured shoulder, meticulously tucking the heavy material to ensure absolutely no freezing draft could reach his shivering frame. She arranged the heavy logs within the hearthstones, banking the glowing embers to guarantee the fire would burn bright and hot until the morning sun returned. She looked at the pale, exhausted face of the man. The fierce, terrifying anger that usually lived within his flint blue eyes was completely hidden beneath his heavy eyelids. He looked deeply peaceful, entirely unaware of the tragic misunderstanding taking shape in the dark room. He firmly believed he had secured her safety. He did not know she viewed her own presence as a deadly, suffocating disease. She reached into the deep pocket of her red flannel shirt. She retrieved the smooth wooden comb, the simple gift he had purchased for her in the chaotic valley settlement. She placed the carved wood gently upon the floorboards, directly beside his large, resting hand. It was the second warmth beat. It was a tangible piece of her profound gratitude. A silent, deeply heartbreaking farewell left behind for him to find in the lonely morning light. Tears gathered hot and heavy within her amber eyes, spilling silently over her pale lashes to track slowly down her soot-stained cheeks. She leaned forward, her face hovering mere inches above his weathered skin. She executed the third warmth beat of the departure. She pressed her soft, trembling lips very gently against the rough knuckles of his uninjured hand. The brief, deeply emotional contact was the closest she had ever come to confessing the immense, overwhelming love swelling within her battered chest. It was a kiss of profound sorrow, a final blessing bestowed upon the only man who had ever truly seen her worth. "Forgive me," she breathed into the quiet shadows, her voice breaking completely beneath the crushing weight of her decision. "I cannot let the violence of my world extinguish the light of yours." She stood to her full height. She turned her back upon the glowing warmth of the stone hearth. She walked with heavily measured steps toward the front of the cabin. She reached the heavy timber door. The thick iron bolt felt incredibly cold beneath her trembling fingers. She slid the metal latch open with agonizing, deliberate slowness, wincing at the quiet, metallic scrape. The heavy wood swung outward, revealing the vast, terrifying darkness of the mountain night. The freezing wind immediately rushed into the room, biting fiercely through the soft flannel and the green wool. Evelyn stepped over the threshold. She placed her small boots upon the icy planks of the wooden porch. She did not look back. If she looked upon the face of the sleeping giant one more time, her fragile resolve would shatter entirely. She pulled the heavy timber door completely shut behind her, leaving the warmth and the safety of the sanctuary locked forever in the past. The vast, white wilderness stretched endlessly before her, offering only bitter cold and certain, absolute peril. She began to walk down the steep, treacherous trail, her small form disappearing rapidly into the swirling snow of the high rocks. The dark, heavy silence of the mountain swallowed her completely. Deep within the warmth of the cabin, the heavy chest of the injured guardian continued to rise and fall in the slow rhythm of exhausted sleep. Will Silas wake before she disappears into the wilderness? The biting wind of the mountain night slashed against the fragile form of Evelyn like 1,000 frozen knives. The storm had fully passed, leaving behind a sky heavy with sharp, glittering stars and a cold so absolute it burned the lungs with every drawn breath. She stumbled through the deep drifts of the unbroken snow, the heavy green shawl offering pitifully little defense against the brutal elements. The oversized red flannel shirt provided only a thin layer over the ruined silk bodice of her past. She tucked her delicate chin deeply into the thick wool of the shawl. The subtle semitale, recurring habit of defense, was utterly useless against the crushing weight of the wilderness. But she clung to the gesture in sheer desperation. She was walking directly toward her own freezing death, choosing the icy oblivion of the high rocks over the cruel, manicured hands of Elias Thorne. Deep within the timber walls of the sanctuary, the sudden, unnatural drop in temperature washed completely over the resting place of the mountain man. The heavy iron bolt was drawn back, allowing a steady draft of freezing air to creep across the wooden floorboards. Silas opened his flint blue eyes. The pain radiating from the torn flesh of his broad shoulder was a searing, white-hot iron. He dragged a heavy breath into his lungs. The air smelled wrong. The delicate, lingering scent of the pine soap was fading rapidly into the harsh, metallic chill of the open winter. He turned his heavy head toward the glowing hearth. The carved ash wood chair was completely empty. He looked down at his uninjured hand. The smooth wooden comb rested silently upon the floorboards. A terrible, heartbreaking testament to the sacrifice she had just chosen to make. The realization struck the massive chest of the Guardian with far more devastating force than the heavy lead bullet of the mercenaries. She believed she was poison. She believed her absence would purchase his safety. Silas pushed himself upward from the thick wolf pelts. The agony in his torn shoulder flared violently, threatening to pull him back into the dark void of unconsciousness. He completely ignored the burning pain. He possessed the sheer, unbreakable willpower of a wild creature fiercely protecting its own. He grabbed the heavy canvas coat resting near the stone hearth. He did not bother to fasten the thick buttons. He stepped heavily out onto the wooden porch, the freezing wind immediately tearing at his loose canvas trousers and the stark white bandages wrapping his shoulder. He tracked the small, desperate footprints deeply indented in the fresh snow. Evelyn reached the edge of the steep, icy tree line. Her small boots slipped upon a hidden patch of black ice. She fell heavily into the deep snowdrift, the biting cold instantly soaking through the soft flannel and the thick wool. The physical exhaustion completely overwhelmed her fragile frame. She lacked the strength to push herself upward. The freezing embrace of the mountain was dark, entirely silent, and surprisingly peaceful. She closed her amber eyes, waiting for the heavy numbness to finally steal the terror of her hunted life away. A massive, towering shadow completely blocked the sharp starlight. "Do not close your eyes," a deep, rough voice rumbled violently through the freezing air. Evelyn gasped. She opened her eyes, staring upward at the towering silhouette of the injured giant. Silas stood perfectly above her, his massive chest heaving with the absolute exertion of the chase. The dark crimson blood was already beginning to seep slowly through the white silk of his bandages. A vivid sensory moment that vividly displayed the agonizing, physical cost of his pursuit. He dropped carefully to his knees beside her trembling form. He executed the first warmth beat of the hour. He immediately pulled his heavy canvas coat completely off his own broad shoulders, wrapping the thick, warm garment securely around her freezing, delicate frame. He entirely ignored the biting wind, striking his own bare skin and his bleeding wound. "You must return to the warm fire," Silas commanded, the fierce loyalty vibrating deeply within his tone. Evelyn shook her head frantically. The tears of profound sorrow spilled over her pale lashes, instantly freezing upon her soot-stained cheeks. "I cannot," she wept, her voice breaking completely into a jagged, desperate sob. "The violent men will return. The immense wealth of Elias Thorne will purchase an entire army. They shot you today. They will kill you tomorrow. I am a walking curse, and I absolutely refuse to let my darkness extinguish the only pure light I have ever found." Silas reached out with his uninjured hand. He completely ignored the frantic, pushing resistance of her pale fingers. He gathered her delicate form directly against his broad, uninjured side. He lifted her from the deep snow with immense, careful strength. "The curse of the eastern cities holds absolutely no power in the high rocks," Silas breathed, pulling her face gently against his warm neck. "The gold of a cruel tyrant cannot buy the soul of a mountain. You did not bring darkness to my door." It was the second warmth beat. The raw, absolute honesty in his deep voice completely shattered the heavy walls of the deep shame she carried. "I have lived 1,000 lifetimes in the absolute quiet," Silas continued, his words pouring forth in a beautiful, lyrical stream of undeniable truth. The solitude was a heavy armor, but the armor was entirely hollow inside. "I built the carved ash wood chair because the room felt completely empty before you arrived. I stood before the guns of the valley, because the blood in my veins means absolutely nothing if I cannot use it to keep you safe. You are not a burden. You are the beating heart of the home. The profound emotional reflection settled incredibly deep within the bruised soul of the woman. She had spent 2 long years believing she was a broken, entirely worthless object, fit only to be hidden away or discarded. Yet, the towering guardian, bleeding in the freezing snow, looked at her and saw a treasure worth dying to protect. He did not care about the horrific bruises upon her delicate skin. He did not care about the immense danger tracking her footsteps. The mutual feelings, the core loop of their deep, silent connection, finally broke through the surface of the terrifying wilderness. Evelyn slowly raised her pale hands. She gently framed the rough, weathered face of the mountain man. She executed the 3rd warmth beat of the night. She brushed the freezing snowflakes away from his dark beard, gazing directly into his flint blue eyes with raw, completely unshielded vulnerability. The near confession hung beautifully between them, heavy with the absolute promise of a second chance at life. You will bleed for me, she whispered, the deep fear of loss warring fiercely against the overwhelming surge of profound love. I will gladly bleed, Silas answered, resting his forehead gently against the soft skin of her brow. But we will survive the fire together. We will not run. We will build the sanctuary stronger. He stood to his full height, holding her securely against his broad chest. He turned his back upon the vast, empty wilderness, carrying her directly back toward the glowing warmth of the distant cabin. The deep misunderstanding was completely resolved, replaced by an unbreakable, unified front. However, the shadow of the violent past was not truly vanished. The hired mercenaries had carried the knowledge of her location directly back to the iron rails. The terrible wrath of Elias Thorne was surely organizing in the distant east, preparing to unleash a final, brutal storm upon the quiet mountain. The fragile peace of the sanctuary was secured for the night, but the dawn would eventually bring the heavy judgment of the world. Can they truly find a life together after the violence of the past? The heavy timber door of the sanctuary closed with a definitive, solid thud, sealing the absolute fury of the winter mountain firmly outside. Silas leaned heavily against the thick wood, the breath rattling deep within his broad chest. Yet the flint blue eyes of the man held a profound, unbreakable peace. He had carried the delicate woman back from the freezing edge of oblivion. Evelyn stood before the glowing stone hearth. She allowed the heavy canvas coat of the guardian to slip from her trembling shoulders. She did not retreat to the dark corner of the room. She did not pull the thick green shawl tightly around her delicate throat. The deeply ingrained, subtle habit of defense was completely gone. She stood tall in the warm light of the fire, the oversized red flannel shirt hanging loosely around her fragile frame. She walked toward the towering mountain man. She executed the 1st warmth beat of the final chapter. She reached out with her pale, steady hands, gently taking the massive, uninjured arm of the giant to guide him back to the thick wolf pelts. The physical pain radiating from his torn shoulder was immense, but the gentle touch of her fingers completely anchored his spirit. The long, heavy weeks of the deep winter slowly passed. The high rocks remained completely encased in thick, impenetrable ice, a frozen fortress that absolutely forbade any further pursuit from the violent mercenaries of the valley. Within the timber walls, a beautiful, quiet transformation took place. Evelyn tended the wound of the guardian with meticulous, daily care. As the dark, angry flesh of his shoulder slowly knit back together, the horrific, ugly bruises painting her own delicate collarbone also began to fade. The dark purple and sickly yellow slowly yielded to the pure, flawless white of her natural skin. The physical healing mirrored the profound emotional redemption taking root deep within their bruised hearts. One quiet evening, as the fire crackled brightly upon the stone hearth, Evelyn reached deeply into the pocket of the red flannel shirt. She retrieved the tattered letter, the heavy document bearing the dark red wax seal of Elias Thorne. She held the parchment in her pale hands. The paper contained the absolute ruin of the cruel tyrant, the definitive proof of his dark crimes. For 2 agonizing years, she had carried the document as a desperate shield, terrified of the massive power it held. Silas sat upon the carved ashwood chair. He watched the woman he deeply loved. He did not ask her to open the letter. He simply waited, offering the absolute emotional safety she required. Evelyn looked at the tattered parchment, and then she looked into the flint-blue eyes of the silent guardian. A profound emotional reflection washed completely over her mind. She did not need the dark leverage of the past to secure her future. The immense wealth and the cruel wrath of the eastern cities held absolutely no power in the pure sanctuary of the mountain. She was no longer a hunted runaway. She was a fiercely protected, deeply cherished woman of the high rocks. She executed the second warmth beat. She stepped forward and placed the tattered letter directly into the roaring flames of the stone hearth. The dry parchment curled instantly, the dark red wax melting into nothingness as the fire eagerly consumed the heavy sins of the past. Silas reached out his massive hand, wrapping his thick, calloused fingers gently around her pale hand as they watched the absolute destruction of her former cage. The dark past was closed forever. The heavy snows of the mountain finally began to thaw. The sharp, bitter wind of the winter softened into the gentle, fragrant breeze of the early spring. The frozen streams cracked open, rushing with vibrant, newly discovered life. Silas was fully healed. He stood outside the cabin, the bright morning sun illuminating his weathered face. He held a large, heavy timber in his massive hands. He was no longer simply carving small wooden blocks. He was actively building a large, beautiful addition to the small cabin, expanding the solitary refuge into a spacious, enduring family home. Evelyn walked out onto the wooden porch. She wore a simple, light cotton dress she had crafted entirely from the purchased valley provisions. Her auburn hair fell in soft, loose waves around her shoulders, completely free of any tension or fear. She carried a small tin cup of hot, sweet tea. She approached the giant. She executed the third warmth beat of the morning. She offered the warm drink, smiling beautifully as he set the heavy timber down to accept the quiet gift. The dark, terrifying shadows of the eastern mansion were entirely banished from her amber eyes, replaced by a radiant, breathtaking light of truly earned happiness. The valley roads are completely clear of ice, Silas murmured gently, his deep voice carrying the rich, comforting tone of pure devotion. The lawmen of the world will not climb the high rocks. The empire of the cruel man crumbled into ash the day you dropped his secrets into the fire. We are entirely free to live. Evelyn rested her pale hand directly against the broad chest of the mountain man, feeling the strong, steady rhythm of his heart beating solidly beneath his flannel shirt. I am already exactly where I belong, she breathed, her voice a lyrical melody of profound emotional catharsis. The storm of the world completely broke against the stone of this mountain. You gave me the profound courage to stop running, Silas. You gave me the beautiful sanctuary of a true home. Silas looked down at the fragile bride who had completely conquered his solitary soul. He leaned forward, pressing his warm lips deeply against hers in a slow, exquisitely tender kiss of absolute devotion. The slow-burn romance found total resolution not in grand, sweeping declarations, but in the quiet, unyielding promise of a shared life built firmly upon the ashes of their former sorrow. The fire within the stone hearth continues to burn brightly, entirely unaffected by the passage of the long years. The deep scars carried by the fragile bride and the silent mountain giant never completely vanished from their skin, but the marks ceased to be a source of profound shame. Instead, they became the quiet, honorable badges of absolute survival. The healing of a shattered spirit is never a swift or easy journey. It requires the immense, terrifying courage to trust another human being after the entire world has proven cruel. The deep, profound lesson of the high rocks is a testament to the undeniable resilience of the human heart. True safety is never found in the heavy gold of the eastern cities, nor is it found in hiding silently within the dark corners of the wilderness. True safety is forged entirely in the unselfish devotion we offer freely to one another. When we choose to stand as an unbreakable shield for the broken, we inadvertently build a beautiful sanctuary for our own lonely souls. The mountain man swore a fierce vengeance upon the dark past of the trembling widow, but he ultimately achieved that vengeance not through violent bloodshed, but through the radical, overwhelming power of gentle, enduring love. The timber home upon the high rocks stands today as a silent, beautiful monument to second chances. The wind still howls through the ancient pines, and the snow still falls heavy upon the roof. But the darkness can never enter the room. They faced the freezing oblivion of the winter, and they emerged into the bright, warm light of the spring entirely whole, proving that even the most fragile, deeply bruised flower can bloom beautifully when planted securely in the sacred, protective soil of a loving home. This story is a work of fiction. Names, characters, businesses, places, events, locales, and incidents are either the products of the imagination of the author or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. This story is intended for mature audiences and explores themes of emotional trauma, healing, and personal resilience. Reader discretion is advised.